In the summer of 1936, the heat across the Arkansas Delta broke every record the National Weather Bureau had kept since observations began in the region. Temperatures north of Little Rock crossed 110 degrees for 11 consecutive days, and by August the smaller Oxbow lakes strung along the abandoned meanders of the Arkansas River had shrunk to cracked mudflats ringed with dying cypress. Wells across 3 counties ran dry that summer. Cattle were driven miles to whatever water still held, and cotton bolls opened weeks early on plants too stressed to finish the season properly. Near the community of Wilmar in Drew County, a body of water known locally as Bell's Slough had watered cattle and cotton land for 3 generations, a long crescent of dark, tannin-stained water tucked behind a ridge of cypress that most residents assumed had always looked exactly the way it looked. That August it disappeared entirely. What the receding water left behind was not the soft lakebed mud that farmers expected when a slough finally gives up its water. Along the eastern bank, where the old lake curved into a low ridge of lowest soil, a line of squared timber emerged from the drying clay, laid edge to edge in a pattern too regular to be driftwood, too deliberate to be the collapsed remains of a fence or a hog pen. A tenant farmer named Otis Pruitt, who had grazed hogs along the Slough his whole life and knew every foot of its ordinary shoreline, walked out onto the exposed bed one afternoon and found that the timber did not stop at the waterline the way a dock or a fish camp platform would. It ran directly into the bank, disappeared beneath a shelf of undercut earth, and by every indication kept going into ground that had never, in any surviving county record, been described as anything but solid pasture. The 1936 heatwave that dried Bell's Slough was, by the Weather Bureau's own later reckoning, the deadliest heat event in the country's recorded history, responsible for more than 5,000 deaths across the central United States that summer alone. In Drew County, its more immediate legacy was smaller and stranger. A lake that had never gone fully dry within living memory chose that particular August to do exactly that, and in doing so exposed something the county had apparently been resting on top of for far longer than anyone still living could say. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Pruitt did what most men in his position would have done. He told the county extension agent, who told the Drew County road supervisor, a man named Ellis Coker, who drove out from Monticello to look for himself once the worst of the week's heat broke. What Coker found, according to the brief note he later filed with the county clerk, was a corduroy surface of hewn oak and cypress planks, laid crosswise over sleeper logs, extending at least 60 feet from the waterline before the earth of the bank closed over it entirely. He measured what he could reach with a length of binder twine knotted at 2-foot intervals, since the county owned no proper surveyor's chain that summer, and estimated a surface width of 10 to 12 feet, wide enough for a loaded wagon and a 2-horse team to pass. Coker took no photographs because the county owned no camera suited to the work, and the nearest studio photographer in Monticello charged more than the road department's small discretionary fund allowed for a project nobody had authorized. He recommended in his note that someone from the State Highway Department come examine the site before the rains returned and the slough refilled, a recommendation he underlined twice according to the surviving page. Nobody came in time. The autumn rains arrived in early October. Bell's Slough filled back to its ordinary depth within 3 weeks, and the timber disappeared beneath 4 feet of water and silt, exactly where it had rested, by any reasonable estimate, for a very long time before anyone alive that summer had ever laid eyes on it. What makes the Bell's Slough timber worth returning to, 90 years later, is not that a farmer found old wood in a dry lake bed. Old wood turns up in dry delta lake beds with some regularity, usually the collapsed remains of a barn foundation or a footbridge nobody bothered to record before it rotted through. What makes this case different is the alignment, and the alignment is the entire argument. The timber did not run parallel to the slough, the way a landing dock or a fish camp platform would, hugging the shoreline for convenience. It ran perpendicular to the water, straight into high ground, on a compass heading that matches no wagon road, no farm lane, and no surveyed county road appearing on any Drew County plat map drawn between the county's organization in 1846 and the present day. A structure built to sit beside water runs along the shore. A structure built to carry traffic across land runs through it, on the shortest practical line between 2 points a traveller actually needed to reach. The Bells Slough timber behaves like the second kind. It runs on a bearing that leads directly away from the modern channel and into a stretch of upland that the surviving written record insists was never anything but timberland and later pasture, with no crossing, no landing, and no destination that any 19th or 20th century document assigns to that particular ridge. To understand why a buried plank road running into nowhere matters, it helps to understand what the delta actually was before the levees came. The land between the Arkansas River and the White River, through most of the 1800s, was not solid ground in any sense a modern traveller would recognize. It was a shifting mosaic of bayou, break, and canebrake, cut through by dozens of channels the river itself had abandoned over centuries as it wandered across its own floodplain, leaving behind exactly the kind of crescent-shaped Oxbow lake that Bells Slough remains today. Travel across this country by wagon was, for most of the year, close to impossible. The mud of the delta bottomland does not simply get soft in wet weather, it becomes a substance early travellers called gumbo, capable of swallowing a wagon wheel to the axle and holding it there for days, and more than one 19th century diary from the region describes teams of mules worked to exhaustion trying to free a single cart from ground that looked, from a distance, perfectly dry. Communities that wanted reliable overland connection to river landings, to cotton gins, to the county seat, built plank roads and corduroy causeways, laying timber directly across the worst stretches of bottomland so that wagons and livestock could cross without sinking to the frame. Arkansas's official state road building program did not exist until the creation of the Arkansas Highway Department in 1913, and even then its earliest work concentrated on graded gravel routes connecting established towns, not private timber causeways across bayou country. Before that date, plank roads in the Delta were built by planters moving cotton to a landing, by timber companies hauling logs to a mill, and occasionally by county road districts operating with almost no central oversight and almost no surviving paperwork. A road built this way could be laid, used hard for 20 years, abandoned the moment a landowner found a shorter crossing, and vanish from every written record except the memory of the people who had once walked it behind a mule team. The stretch of the Arkansas River nearest Bells Slough carries an older documented history than most of the Delta counties around it. Arkansas Post, established by French traders in 1686, roughly 40 miles downstream, was for more than a century the only permanent European settlement on the lower Arkansas River, and its surviving account books, held today at the Arkansas History Commission, describe a trade network running up and down the river that moved deerskins, bear oil, salt, and eventually furs between the post and the Quapaw villages that occupied this section of the valley, long before Drew County existed in any administrative sense. The Quapaw Nation's presence along this stretch of the river is documented in French colonial records stretching back to the 1670s, well before American settlers organized Drew County in 1846, and Quapaw trails connecting river landings to inland hunting grounds are referenced, though rarely mapped with any real precision, in several surviving colonial-era accounts held at the Commission. None of those accounts specifically describe a crossing at what is now Bells Slough, and no colonial map places a road at this exact bend of the river. The connection between the documented Quapaw and French trade network and the Bells Slough timber remains, on the current evidence, a matter of plausible historical context rather than direct proof. But the timeline fits in a way that is difficult to dismiss outright. A crossing built to move trade goods between a river landing and inland hunting or agricultural ground, constructed sometime during the period when the Quapaw and French colonial traders were actively using this stretch of the Arkansas, would predate American settlement of Drew County by more than half a century, and would have gone out of use, been forgotten, and been swallowed by an Oxbow lake in precisely the way the physical evidence at Bells Slough suggests it was. Whether the road actually belongs to that documented trade network, to some other undocumented use from the same general period, or to a later and simply unrecorded agricultural crossing built by early American settlers before the county's formal organization, is not a question the surviving evidence can answer with confidence. What the historical record does establish, without any need for speculation, is that organized cross-country travel through exactly this stretch of the delta, connecting river landings to inland destinations, was already an established practice for more than a century before Ellis Coker ever measured a plank with a length of knotted twine. This is the world the Bell's Slough timber appears to belong to, at least on the surface, and if the story stopped there, it would be an interesting but fairly ordinary footnote to delta transportation history. Except the alignment does not match any documented plank road in Drew County's sparse 19th century road petitions, and the position of the timber relative to the modern Slough tells a stranger story than a simple forgotten farm crossing ever could. Bell's Slough is not a natural lake in the way a spring-fed pond is natural. It is an oxbow, the abandoned bend of a much older channel of the Arkansas River, cut off from the main river sometime before the 1840s, when the river straightened its course during a major flood and left the old bend to fill in slowly with still water and settling silt, exactly the process that produces every oxbow lake along the river's floodplain. A road built to cross the Slough at its current location would only make ordinary sense if it had been built after that cutoff, once the old channel had already become a quiet lake rather than a moving river. But Coker's own 1836 measurements, cross-checked against the depth of undisturbed clay above the timber where it entered the bank, suggest a burial depth that predates the fill sequence geologists associate with the cutoff. If the road was laid while the old channel was still carrying flowing river water rather than built afterward across an already quiet lake, the road cannot be a straightforward 19th century farm crossing at all. It would have to predate the Arkansas River's own most recent course through that stretch of Drew County, laid down across a channel the river had not yet chosen to abandon. Independent of anything Coker or the local newspaper recorded, the broader geological question of when the Arkansas River actually abandoned this stretch of its old channel has been studied on its own terms, separate from any question about the timber. Sediment coring conducted on Delta Oxbow lakes during a 1992 Arkansas Geological Survey assessment of river migration patterns found that most cutoffs in this reach of the Arkansas date to a period stretching from the late 1700s through the 1840s, based on layered silt deposition rates and the depth at which cutoff-era organic material appears in the core samples. Bell's Slough itself was not among the lakes specifically cored in that assessment, and no comparable study has been conducted on it since, which means its own cutoff date remains an estimate drawn from the wider regional pattern rather than a direct measurement taken from the lake itself. If Bell's Slough followed the same general timeline as its neighboring Oxbows, a road built to cross active river water at that bend would have to date to before that window closes, sometime in the last decades of the 1700s or the opening decades of the 1800s, a period for which Drew County itself has almost no surviving written record of any kind, since the county was not organized until 1846, and the area's earlier population, whoever exactly occupied or passed through this particular bend, left behind no courthouse, no newspaper, and no clerk to file a report. For comparison, the earliest corduroy road specifications adopted by the Arkansas Highway Department after its 1913 founding called for sleeper logs no less than 8 inches in diameter, spaced at intervals of roughly 18 inches, with surface planking milled to a uniform thickness at a sawmill before being hauled to the site. The Bell's Slough sleepers, by Coker's own estimate, were spaced closer to 2 feet apart, not far from the department's later standard, but the surface planking above them showed no milling marks at all, only the adze work of a hand tool, which places the road's construction technique squarely outside the standardized practices the state itself was still decades away from formalizing when the timber was laid. A road built to a later official specification would show saw marks across every plank. This one does not, and that single distinction is, in the absence of any datable organic material yet recovered from the site itself, the strongest physical argument for treating the Bells-Slough crossing as considerably older than any state-era road-building program in Arkansas's documented history. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. No one in 1936 had the tools to settle that question with certainty, and to be direct about the limits of what follows, no one has fully settled it since. What exists is a short chain of partial evidence, assembled across 9 decades by people who were rarely looking for the same thing at the same time, and who rarely knew that anyone before them had looked at all. Coker's note survives today in the Drew County Clerk's file, a single handwritten page describing hewn planks, sleeper logs laid at intervals of roughly 2 feet, and a surface width he estimated at 10 to 12 feet. He described the surface wood as oak and the sleepers beneath as cypress, a combination consistent with roads built specifically for wet ground, since cypress resists rot in standing water far longer than oak, and delta builders understood this distinction well before any formal engineering education reached the county. He noted, almost as an aside near the bottom of the page, that the exposed end of the roadbed showed old axe and adze marks rather than saw marks, meaning the timber had been shaped by hand tools before it was laid, not milled at a sawmill. Arkansas's first steam sawmills reached the Delta counties in meaningful numbers only after the Civil War. A hand-hewn roadbed does not prove an early date on its own, since hand tools remained in ordinary use on poorer Delta farms well into the 20th century, but combined with the buried, pre-cutoff alignment, it points toward a construction period earlier than Drew County's own written history reaches with any real confidence. The second piece of the record comes not from Drew County but from a Little Rock newspaper item published in September of 1936, roughly 4 weeks after Pruitt's discovery, under a small headline concerning the drought's effect on farm ponds across the southeast part of the state. The article mentions the Bells-Slough timber in a single paragraph near the end, almost in passing, and includes one detail Coker's note does not contain: a claim, attributed only to unnamed local residents, that older Drew County families had spoken for years of a road running from the old river landing at Half Moon Bend toward the Wilmar area, a road that had gone out of use so long ago that nobody living could say when it was built or by whom. Half Moon Bend was the name given, in 19th century river surveys, to the very meander that later became Bell's Slough once the Arkansas cut itself a straighter channel and left the bend behind. If the newspaper's second-hand account reflects anything more than folk memory attaching itself conveniently to a strange discovery, it would mean local families had preserved, in conversation rather than in writing, an awareness that something predating their own settlement of the area had once crossed the river at that bend. That is a claim worth treating with real caution. It survives in a single newspaper paragraph, sourced to nobody in particular, printed once, and never followed up by the paper or by anyone else. But it is also the only surviving suggestion of why a road might have existed there at all, crossing a channel that would only later abandon its bed and leave the timber sealed beneath a lake. What happened to the site after 1936 is its own small case study in how a discovery gets absorbed by inattention rather than by any deliberate decision to bury it. Coker's recommendation that the State Highway Department examine the site went unanswered, not because anyone in Little Rock actively declined the request, but because the department's surviving 1936 correspondence logs show no record of the letter ever arriving at the state office in the first place. Rural mail delivery in Drew County that year was disrupted for several weeks by the same drought conditions that had dried the slough, as unpaved roads became too dust-choked and rutted for regular truck delivery on the routes serving the more remote parts of the county. Whether Coker's letter was lost in transit, misfiled at the state office once it arrived, or simply never sent past the county courthouse in the confusion of that summer, is a gap the surviving paper trail does not close. The rains came, the slough refilled, and the timber went back under water before any state engineer had reason to make the drive south from Little Rock to look at a road that, on paper, did not officially exist. By the time the next serious drought exposed the Arkansas Delta's Oxbow lakes, in the summer of 1954, Otis Pruitt had died. Ellis Coker had retired to Pine Bluff and rarely spoke of his years with the county road department, and nobody remaining in Drew County government connected that year's low water levels to a report 18 years old, filed away under a courthouse heading that had nothing to do with roads at all. There is a second layer of neglect worth naming directly, because it involves an institution with far more resources than a rural county road department ever had. The United States Army Corps of Engineers spent much of the 1930s and 1940s conducting detailed hydrological and channel migration surveys of the lower Arkansas River, part of the broader flood control program that followed the catastrophic Mississippi River flood of 1927. Corps survey teams mapped old channel scars, abandoned meanders, and oxbow formations across exactly the stretch of Drew and Desha counties that includes Bell's Slough, because understanding where a river had moved in the past helped engineers predict where it might move again in a future flood. A Corps survey conducted in 1941, held today in the National Archives Record Group for Civil Works Projects, includes a channel migration map of the area that labels the Bell's Slough Oxbow by its modern name and estimates an approximate cutoff date consistent with local accounts, but makes no mention whatsoever of any structure within or beneath it. This is not evidence that the Corps found nothing and chose to hide it. Channel migration surveys of this kind were conducted primarily from aerial photography and shoreline reconnaissance, not from excavation or underwater probing, and a buried roadbed sitting under several feet of water and accumulated silt would have been functionally invisible to the survey method the Corps was actually using in 1941. It does mean, however, that an agency with the engineering capacity to investigate the site thoroughly was working within a few miles of it, for reasons entirely unrelated to Pruitt's discovery, and had no institutional reason to connect the two projects. The gap here was not a cover-up in any deliberate sense. It was two separate records, generated for two separate purposes 5 years apart, that never crossed paths on anyone's desk. What survives from the period closest to the discovery itself, and what functions as the closest thing to a direct witness account of the timber, is a short reminiscence written not in 1936, but in 1961, 25 years after the fact, by Coker's daughter, a schoolteacher named Vera Holcombe, who had accompanied her father to the Slough as a girl of 13. Holcombe's account was never published in any journal or newspaper. It survives because she wrote it down at the request of a Monticello women's history club that was collecting local reminiscences for a county centennial project, and a typed copy was kept in the club's own files, later donated to the Drew County Historical Society, where it remains uncatalogued in a folder but accessible to anyone who asks. Holcombe describes walking out onto the cracked bed of the slough behind her father, the smell of dead fish and drying mud thick in the August heat, and the moment he knelt at the exposed timber and ran his hand along the surface of a plank. She recalls him saying that the wood felt harder and darker than any fence rail or barn timber she had ever touched, closer to the ironwood he remembered from an old flatboat landing his own grandfather had described to him as a boy, decades before Coker himself was born. She recalls that he measured the road's width with the knotted binder twine, since the county still owned no proper surveyor's chain that year either, and that he pressed his walking stick into the bank where the timber disappeared and found it kept going, by his own estimate, several more feet before the stick finally met solid, undisturbed clay. Holcombe's reminiscence includes one detail that appears nowhere else in the paper record. Her father's remark, made quietly as they walked back to the car that afternoon, that whoever built the road had built it to last, choosing the hardest wood available to them and laying it with a care that a temporary farm crossing would never have required or repaid. Whether that impression reflects a trained road builder's genuine engineering judgment or a father's attempt to make an ordinary hot afternoon memorable for his daughter is something the surviving record cannot resolve on its own. It is the only account of a human being's direct physical contact with the Bell's Slough timber that survives in any detail, and for that reason it carries a weight the drier institutional paperwork simply does not. The official record and Holcombe's private one agree on the essential physical facts of the site: hewn timber, cypress, and a harder wood beneath it, a width suited to loaded wagon traffic, an alignment that runs into solid ground rather than along the shoreline, and a depth of burial that predates the county's own written history of road construction in the area by a margin nobody has fully explained. They diverge only in what they imply about intent. Coker's official note treats the discovery as an engineering curiosity worth one follow-up visit that never came. Holcombe's reminiscence, filtered through a father's remembered words and a daughter's decades of quiet reflection, treats it as evidence of purposeful, patient construction by people who expected the road to carry weight for a very long time. Neither account claims to know who built it. Neither invents a name, a date, or a vanished people to fill the gap the physical evidence leaves open. What both preserve, in their different registers and for their different reasons, is the same physical object, a road that should not exist where it does, built by hands that worked with a patience the surrounding written record has never been able to explain. Bell's Slough refilled in the autumn of 1936 and has stayed at or near its ordinary depth in nearly every year since, with two notable exceptions worth recording here. The drought of 1954 dropped water levels across the Arkansas Delta significantly, though contemporary accounts from Drew County make no specific mention of the slough reaching bottom that particular year, and no one on record appears to have gone looking for the timber a second time, while the memory of Coker's original visit was still relatively fresh. The drought of 2012, the most severe the region had seen since the 1930s, dropped the Slough low enough that a Drew County Historical Society volunteer walked the exposed margin with a metal detector, hoping to locate the site described in Holcombe's reminiscence, which the Society had by then catalogued and cross-referenced against Coker's original clerk's file. She found waterlogged fence wire, a scattering of 19th-century farm tools, and, along a stretch of the eastern bank consistent with the 1936 description, several sections of dark, heavily weathered timber protruding a few inches above the mud before an unexpected September rain raised the water table again and covered the site before any further examination could take place. No formal archaeological excavation has ever been conducted at Bell's Slough. No archaeologist affiliated with a university or with the Arkansas Archaeological Survey has published findings on the site, and the survey's own site files, when checked, list Bell's Slough only as an unassessed historic period location pending future evaluation, a designation that has not changed since it was first entered into the state database sometime in the 1980s, and has simply carried forward, unreviewed, through every subsequent update of the records. The slough today sits quietly behind a stand of second-growth cypress a few miles off the state highway, unremarkable to anyone who does not already know what Ellis Coker found there in the last dry summer before the war changed everything else about Drew County. The water holds its ordinary color, dark with tannin from the cypress roots, and gives no visible sign of what runs beneath it, on a bearing that no wagon road, no county plat, and no Corps of Engineers survey has ever managed to account for in 90 years of separate and unconnected looking. Somewhere under that water, hewn oak planks still rest on cypress sleepers. Laid across the bed of a channel, the Arkansas River abandoned before anyone now living was born, running toward high ground on a heading that only makes sense if the people who built it were crossing water that had not yet become a lake at all. What they were carrying across it, where the road continued once it reached the ridge on the far side, and who judged the crossing important enough to build with timber meant to last rather than timber meant to serve a single season, remains exactly where Otis Pruitt found it in 1936, sealed beneath the slough, waiting for the next year dry enough and the next person patient enough to go looking again before the water comes back. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.